Well, let's look more at those military exercises next night, with that Russian warship heading to South Africa next month as part of the exercise with the country's navy. China will also be joining. We understand the Russian warship is armed with hypersonic Zircon missiles. The joint drill is set to take place from the 17th to the 26th of February. The South African National Defence Force says this exercise will strengthen the ties between the three countries. Let's discuss more about the significance of this. I'm joined by Guy Martin. He's the editor of Defenceweb. Guy, good afternoon. Welcome to today. Thank you very much for your time. Just to try and wrap our heads around the significance of these exercises coming in. It's not the first time, we do know that, and these happen from time to time. But in the world that we live in now, South Africa has been criticized, and Dr. Naledi Pandor, just a short while ago, I played a bite from her as she was responding to questions and at the briefing with her counterpart from Russia, Sergei Lavrov in Pretoria, saying South Africa has a right to do this.
Oh, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. Yes, South Africa does indeed have a right to host an exercise with its allies and partners. But I think the SANDF and the government as a whole has not read the room, and they're a little bit tone deaf towards the implications that an exercise like this has and the message that it's sending. The first exercise, MOSI, between Russia and China was held in 2019, and of course there was no issue then. But the fact that this exercise is happening around the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the timing, it's a little bit insensitive. So while it's perfectly allowable, it's a questionable move on the government's part to let this go ahead.
What's the significance of it going ahead under what you've just explained at this time in the world?
I think it's another signal that South Africa is supportive of Russia. And although the government is sticking to the line that South Africa is a neutral third party and hopes for a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine, we've seen quite a few signs that South Africa is leaning more towards Russia than Ukraine. For example, the visit by the Lady R, the Russian vessel that was sanctioned, to Simonstown earlier this year, that's another indication that South Africa is leaning more towards the Russian side.
Yeah. So, and how should we interpret what this means for the South African National Defence Force? They say that these exercises will strengthen the already flourishing relations between South Africa, Russia and China. I mean, does this mean that when we're taking part as a defence force and our Navy is taking part, that our capability is better today than before?
Look, training exercises are always useful, and they do provide a lot of good experience for the navies involved. So, at a sort of a non-political lower level, sort of boots on the ground level, so to speak, it will be useful for the South African Navy to carry out an exercise and get some experience, interact with different navies and see how they do things, share practices and so forth. But the Navy is very short on available vessels. Its budget is absolutely minimal, and because of the shrinking budget, its sea hours have been cut. So a few years ago, the Navy was allocated about 12,000, well, had enough money to spend about 12,000 hours at sea. At the moment, it's about 8,000 hours. So it's quite difficult for the Navy to put serviceable vessels in the water, and it's a bit of a strain carrying out exercises like this. But on a more high-level diplomatic perspective, the rationale behind continuing with this exercise is questionable. If you look at the amount of trade that South Africa gets with Russia versus the West, or even any other of the BRICS countries, it's extremely minimal. I think the European Union is the largest trading partner to South Africa. So the payoff, I'm not sure if it's worth it. If you look at how much criticism South Africa is getting because of this, from a political point of view, it's maybe a dubious choice.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, as you're speaking there, because this also coincides with South Africa beginning to chair the BRICS bloc, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I'm just wondering if they could have had much choice, or it makes South Africa's position in BRICS stronger.
Well, indeed, it does help with the BRICS partnership. There's no question about that. But as I mentioned, the choice of closing up to Russia, we're alienating a lot of our other trading partners and our other allies. For instance, we do far more trade with the United States than we do with Russia. We do far more trade with the European Union than we do with Russia. So while we're choosing to side with the Russians, we're alienating our other so-called allies, and that might come back to bite us.